So I'm sure you've heard Muslim apologists repeatedly claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved since its revelation. Not just in its broader themes and overall message, they claim that every single letter and word of the Quran has been preserved exactly as it was revealed to Muhammad 1400 years ago. Now, disregarding the obvious non sequitur that textual preservation does not in any way prove the divinity or miraculousness of any text, what I'm going to do here is that I'll show you that this very claim of the preservation of the Quran is demonstrably false. Not only has the actual Quran not been preserved in any form, written or oral, there was never an original Quran in the first place. All of this can be proven directly from Islamic sources themselves, as you'll soon see. As always, all references will be in the description below. I'll also be going over the following claims made by Muslim apologists and showing how they are false. One, that the Quran was preserved by the companions of Muhammad who had perfectly memorized it. And two, that there exist manuscripts of the Quran commissioned by the Caliph Uthman like the ones at Topkapi or Samarkand or in Cairo. Okay, so let's start with the traditionally accepted chronology of the compilation of the Quran by Islamic scholars. It goes like this. The standard Sunni narrative is that the Quran was revealed orally to the Prophet Muhammad over a period of 23 years, which his companions memorized and wrote down the fragments of it on date palm leaves, stones, and other materials. Notably, it was never compiled into book form during the life of the Prophet. But after his death, during Abu Bakr's caliphate, Abu Bakr was the first caliph of Islam, the first collection was made at the urging of Omar, since many who had memorized it had been killed in battle. Zayd bin Thabit, one of the Prophet's scribes, was tasked with gathering the verses from written fragments and memory into a single manuscript. This copy was kept with Abu Bakr, then Omar, who was the second caliph of Islam, and then later Hafsa, who was Omar's daughter and the wife of the Prophet. During Uthman's caliphate, Uthman was the third caliph of Islam, he ordered an official recension based on Hafsa's manuscript. Zayd bin Thabit was again commissioned for this task, along with some others, and using Hafsa's manuscript and the other existing written materials, copies were made and distributed to major cities. Other variant written materials were ordered to be destroyed, fixing the standardized text that we have as the Quran today. Okay, so this is the standard Islamic narrative about the compilation of the Quran, accepted by Muslim scholars. If you want to see the definitive treatment on this topic from the Islamic perspective, I recommend reading the book, which is in English by the way, by the renowned scholar of Islam, Muhammad Mustafa al-Azani, titled The History of the Quranic Text, From Revelation to Compilation. It's available on Amazon, but the PDF can also be found on several sites for free if you search for it. This is the definitive treatment on this topic from the Islamic perspective, and I'll be referencing this book to show the internal contradictions in this narrative. You can also get a pretty good overview of this topic by reading these articles from Yaqeen Institute that go over some of the same history. Okay, so where does this picture break down? Well, pretty much at every level. So let's take it from the start. So first, and the most serious issue here, is that we are told by Muslims themselves that during his own lifetime, the Prophet failed to compile all the texts of the Quran into a single book. No perfect primary text was made by him, which could be used by his companions and followers to copy into their own versions of the Quran. Not only did Muhammad fail to compile the Quran into a complete text, he didn't even nominate anyone to do so when he was close to death. And it's not like Muhammad's death was a surprise to him. According to Islamic sources, Muhammad knew he was close to death in his final year. Yet he still never compiled the Quran into a single text himself. That is, all authentic Islamic sources accept that there was never a Muhammadan Quran. This is what I mean by there was never an original Quran in the first place. Muhammad failed at his primary task, which was to deliver an uncorrupted Quran. Now, Muslim apologists are probably screaming at me here. They're yelling that the Quran was perfectly preserved through memorization by Muhammad's companions, and was also preserved in fragmentary written forms by many of them. So the Quran was still preserved even if it was not all in book form at this point. But like I said, we'll go over all these claims to one step at a time to show that they're all false. So just be patient. The first point I want you to take away here is that there is no Muhammadan codex. There never was one. Muhammad failed to produce one in his lifetime, nor did he appoint anyone in his lifetime to produce a full codex. This was such a massive mistake that within 2 years of Muhammad's death, his own closest companions were arguing that they should not compile the Quran into a single text because Muhammad himself never did so. This here is Abu Bakr explicitly referencing Muhammad's failure to produce this text as his reason for not wanting to do so himself. Zayd bin Thabit is also reluctant for that same reason. So there is no Muhammadan Quran. All the codices of the Quran in existence are by others, that is, by non-prophets who are fallible. So already, just by this admission alone, the reliability of the preservation of the Quran is of the same standard as that of the Bible, which is to say that it is accepted on faith. And it is not possible to empirically prove it because there was never a Quran codified by Muhammad himself. Why this is such a monumental mistake by Muhammad is because Moses and Jesus never claimed to have brought a revealed book with them. According to Judaism, Moses came with the law, and this was subsequently compiled into books by his followers much later. And Christians believe that Jesus came with grace, the core message of which his followers eventually compiled into books called the Gospels. But Muhammad and the Quran itself repeatedly claim that the Quran is a book that was revealed to Muhammad. It is not just some law or moral code or hopeful news of the hereafter. It is an actual book that has been sent down to Muhammad. We see this repeatedly in the Quran. For example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 5, and the second verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, and verse 105 of Surah An-Nisa, and many more places. So given that the Quran was clearly understood to be a book, replacing the scriptures before it, it is a colossal mistake by Muhammad to not compile it into book form prior to his death, or at least appoint someone to do so before dying. He did neither of those. So all we have now are fallible people trying their best to preserve what they believed to be the text of the Quran, with no prophet of God among them to confirm or deny their beliefs. This is why there were numerous debates among the early companions and their followers about the contents of the Quran. I don't have time to go over these disagreements here, but my point here is that there is no original Muhammadan Quran. But if you want to read more about this topic, I recommend going over this paper by Hussein Mudarrisi titled Early Debates on the Integrity of the Quran, a Brief Survey, published in 1993 in Studia Islamica. Nevertheless, now that we have clearly established that there was no Quranic text created by Muhammad himself, let's look at the claims about the Quran being perfectly memorized by Muhammad's companions during his lifetime. After all, Muslim scholars have repeatedly talked about the importance of memorization to the early Muslim community. Memorizing the Quran would result in the ultimate reward of protection from hellfire. As a result, the memorization spread to multiple cities. There was also a school for the memorization of the Quran created by the Prophet. In fact, males, females, children, people of all different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, persons with disabilities, and enslaved people all learned and memorized the Quran. So, according to Islamic scholarship, the number of people who had fully memorized the Quran during the life of the Prophet were numerous. Great, so let's take a look at the lines of evidence for this claim. First, the direct evidence. Now, obviously, we have no direct evidence of this memorization, none whatsoever. That is, there is no audio recording of the recitation of the Quran from 1400 years ago showing that a companion of the Prophet had perfectly memorized the Quran and it was recited exactly as it is now. So given that there is no direct evidence for this claim, let's take a look at the indirect evidence. Are there any independent reports of this claim from contemporaneous sources? That is there a single non-Muslim source claiming that Muslims had perfectly memorized the Quran in its entirety during or around the time of the Prophet? No, not a single one. Only Muslim scholars made that claim. But those are not independent claims. Muslims are biased towards believing that the Quran was perfectly memorized, so their claims are just as reliable as the claims by the followers of Joseph Smith stating that the Mormon prophet also performed miracles. Obviously, no Muslim would accept these claims of miracles by Mormons made of their own prophet because of this bias. So using this same standard, all claims by Muslims of their prophet are also suspect. But here's the big difference between these two claims. Several of the reports of the miracles performed by Joseph Smith were published in his own lifetime by his followers. So what about the claims of perfect memorization of the Quran by Muslims? When were those published? Over 100 years after the death of Muhammad, most around 200 years after his death. That is, there are zero contemporaneous sources stating that Muslims had memorized the Quran perfectly, even among Muslim sources. So how reliable should one take those reports of memorization that showed up more than a century later, and that too only among Muslim sources? Not very. No objective assessment can ignore the massive bias here. The point being that the claims about the perfect memorization of the Quran by the companions of Prophet are based entirely on faith. There is zero evidence of this memorization outside of faith claims. But the interesting thing is, there is evidence against this claim from within the Islamic sources. As I mentioned earlier, there were frequent debates about the integrity of the Quran among the early Muslim community, according to Islamic sources themselves, debates which would not be possible if numerous companions of the Prophet had perfectly memorized the Quran. But the specific incident I would like to bring up here is the case of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who was also a companion of the Prophet, and not just any companion. The Prophet had instructed his followers to learn the Quran specifically from him, as we can see in this report here. He's the first person mentioned in this list. And even Yaqeen Institute mentioned that he was one of the companions of the Prophet who had perfectly memorized the Quran during the Prophet's lifetime. As Yaqeen's article states about him, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, about whom the Prophet said, "I approve for my ummah whatever Ibn Abd approves for them." He also said, "Whoever would like to recite the Quran fresh as it was revealed, let him recite it according to the recitation of Ibn Abd." Among the Prophet's companions, Ibn Mas'ud is considered the greatest contributor to the mass teaching of the Quran. So what did this Ibn Mas'ud say about the Quran? He actually believes that there were two surahs or chapters that were not supposed to be part of the Quran, but were added to it by Zayd bin Thabit. There's an article on this topic by Seeker's Guidance, which you can read here, but the summary they state is, it can be inferred that Ibn Mas'ud acknowledged the two surahs, but was unaware that they were part of the Quran. And they conclude that Ibn Mas'ud's lack of awareness about the Quranic nature of those two surahs does not diminish his stature. Yes, his stature was that he was the one recommended by the Prophet to learn the Quran according to Islamic sources. So his saying that those surahs are not supposed to be part of the Quran is a pretty serious issue, wouldn't you say? But the main point I'm trying to highlight here is, why the dispute in the first place? If numerous companions of the Prophet had perfectly memorized the entire Quran, word for word, then why not just ask one of them whether these surahs were part of the Quran or not? Because for every dispute, you could just ask someone who had memorized the Quran about which option was the correct one, and they would be able to tell you. And that would solve the dispute immediately. The only reason these disputes could nevertheless exist in early Islam is if there was no perfect memorization of the Quran. If there was widespread memorization, as Muslim sources attest, then these types of dispute could not possibly exist, let alone exist with a person for whom Muslim sources themselves admit that the Prophet instructed people to learn the Quran from. So the claim about the perfect memorization of the Quran is obviously a lie introduced by later Islamic sources to bolster the case of a perfectly preserved Quran, when in fact it never was. But the most compelling rejection of the claim about the Quran being perfectly memorized comes, ironically, from Abu Bakr's own instructions to Zayd bin Thabit and Zayd's own words as recorded in the Islamic sources. As we read in page 151 of Azami's book, Abu Bakr's instructions to Zayd were to accept only what had been written in the Prophet's presence, not what had been penned from memory. And an even more devastating quote from Zayd bin Thabit. When asked by Abu Bakr to collect the Quran into a single book, as reported in Sahih Bukhari, he said, "By Allah, if Abu Bakr had ordered me to shift a mountain among the mountains from one place to another, it would not have been heavier for me than this ordering me to collect the Quran." So, if the Quran had already been perfectly memorized by dozens of companions, and even children had memorized it, then why this difficulty? In fact, Zayd himself was one of the supposed memorizers of the Quran, as we can see here. So why is it so difficult for him to compile the Quran into book form? He knows it all by heart. Just write it down from memory and then call one other memorizer to go over what he's written down to check for any errors. Problem solved. or call 2 or 3 other memorizers to get them to all check. They can't all be wrong, can they? After all, they have memorized it perfectly, right? So why is this the most difficult task of Zaid's life? And why would Abu Bakr instruct him to scour for written materials and not rely on memory? These reports found within Islamic sources strongly implied that the Quran wasn't reliably memorized by anyone at that time. I want to make clear, though, that I have no idea if these reports are historically reliable, because remember, they were all written down more than 100 years after the events they are describing. The point is, not only are there no independent and verifiable reports about the supposed perfect memorization of the Quran during the Prophet's lifetime, there are reports that strongly imply the exact opposite. So, to summarize, there is exactly zero contemporaneous evidence of the supposed mass memorization of the Quran by the companions of the Prophet during his lifetime. Muslims believe this claim simply because it confirms their faith. It is not a verifiable claim. So using this claim as evidence for the miraculousness of the Quran is as absurd as using the miracles of Joseph Smith reported by Mormons as evidence of the truthfulness of Joseph Smith. Much more absurd, actually, because at least the miracles of Joseph Smith were reported by his followers in his lifetime, a time during which newspapers and telegram services existed. Okay, so the claims about Muhammad's Quran being perfectly preserved are all completely unverifiable. But what about these other early codices? What about the codices of Abu Bakr and Uthman? Well, I'm glad you asked, because trust me, you're going to find this very interesting. Let's start with the Codex of Abu Bakr. This was the first codex of the Quran ever created according to Muslim scholars. Now, this codex almost certainly never existed, but let's put aside my opinion on this and let's take the claims of these Muslim scholars at face value. So the closest companion of the Prophet, who was also the first caliph of Islam, has this codex created within just 2 years of the Prophet's death. And not only was this codex in his possession, as we read here in Yaqeen's article on this topic, it was then passed down to the second caliph Omar, who was also one of the closest companions of Muhammad. And after Omar passed away, it was inherited by Hafsa, Omar's daughter, and also one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. So where is it now? Okay, now bear with me. For now, I have blacked out most of this paragraph that explains what happened to it. But you can see the word destroyed in there, correct? So yes, it was destroyed. So surprise, surprise, no one can access it anymore to confirm its contents. But how did it get destroyed? I want you to take a moment to think about how Muslims ended up losing this priceless artifact, the first ever Quran. What do you think happened? Was it a fire? A flood? Was it lost during the Mongol invasions? Any guesses? Nope, none of those. Read for yourself. So this monumental codex, the first Quran ever, one which was the personal Quran of Abu Bakr and Omar, the Prophet's closest companions, and also of the Prophet's own wife Hafsa, was destroyed by Muslims themselves, by Marwan bin Hakam, the cousin of Uthman and the fourth Umayyad caliph. And just look at the reason. If I didn't show you this explicitly in writing, you would think I'm lying to you because of how stupid it is. It was destroyed by Marwan because, quote, I feared that time would pass and people would start to have misgivings about it, or say it contains something that has not been written. So Marwan destroyed it because he was concerned that people might start thinking that it was different from the Quran that was widely available. Not that they already thought that that Quran was different, but that people might start thinking so in the future. Think about this for a minute. Let's say that you have a book in your possession of the utmost religious and cultural importance, and it's the original manuscript, one from which all other manuscripts have been copied, the primary text. And you are concerned that people might start suspecting that this manuscript of yours is corrupt, that it is different in some way from all the other copies available. What would you do? Would you A, try to preserve that original text as carefully as possible so that if there are doubts about its authenticity, you could easily dispel them by demonstrating that your manuscript is in fact perfectly accurate? Or B, destroy it? Which option should you pick? Which makes more sense if you're concerned that people might suspect that your codex was different from the copies that were made from it? Tough question, right? Yeah, see how stupid this is? Destroying the original text when people are suspicious of it only confirms their suspicion. It doesn't dispel it. It does the exact opposite of what you're claiming you want to do. How monumentally stupid is this reason? And Muslim scholars quote it uncritically in their text, and Yaqeen Institute also mentions it uncritically as if it makes perfect sense. This is one of the many reasons why this Quran of Abu Bakr almost certainly did not exist. If it did exist, no Muslim would ever just casually destroy it like this, not the personal codex of the closest companion of the Prophet and his wife, and the first Quran that was ever produced. So either this codex never existed, and Muslim scholars made up the whole narrative of its existence to confer legitimacy to the claims of Quran's authenticity, and then, because it never really existed, they were forced to make up the narrative of its destruction too, and come up with this nonsense. Or it did exist, and was so substantially different from the Uthmanic manuscripts in circulation that Marwan had to destroy it to hide the evidence of this discrepancy. Now, I believe it never existed, but in either case, this is just a glaring example of the massive inconsistencies in the Islamic narrative of the Quran's compilation, one that Muslim scholars are utterly blind to because it goes entirely against their core beliefs. Okay, so Muslim scholars themselves accept that the Codex of Abu Bakr doesn't exist. But what about the four codices of Uthman, the ones he sent out to different cities to serve as references? Where are they now? I think you should be able to see where this is going now. Not one of those codices exist. Not a single one, not a single page of any of these four codices exist. And this is admitted by Muslim scholarship too now. Here is what Muslim scholars say about the supposed Uthmanic codices. I'm showing you all of this from IslamicAwareness.org, a site run by Muslims themselves documenting the early Quranic manuscripts, just so I'm not accused of being biased by providing non-Muslim references. These are the supposed Uthmanic manuscripts. The Quran of Uthman at Tashkent? Nope, not Uthmanic since the date is 2nd century Hijri. The Qurans compiled by Uthman were all completed by early 1st century, within the first 30 years of the Islamic calendar. The Quran of Uthman at the Topkapı Museum in Istanbul? Also no. What about the Quran of Uthman at the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul, Turkey? Again, no. The Quran of Uthman in St. Petersburg, Russia? Not Uthmanic. And the same for the two Qurans of Uthman in Cairo. You can go through all the rest of the codices listed here and check for yourself. There isn't a single codex of Uthman left, not even a single page. Now, am I saying that the Uthmanic codices never existed just like Abu Bakr's Quran? No, not at all. There is considerable evidence that these codices existed, and the 10 or so Quranic variants that are widely in circulation today are essentially just copies of the Uthmanic codices, with some scribal errors making up some of the variations. But the point is, there isn't even a complete Uthmanic codex in existence today, let alone the Codex of Muhammad. So where does this leave us? There is no Codex Muhammadicus. Muhammad never created one. All the claims about the supposed memorization of the Quran come only from Muslim sources, and that too decades later at best, while most are more than a century later. There is zero independent evidence of the Quran being perfectly memorized, and there's evidence from Islamic sources themselves that suggests that it could not have been memorized because of the disputes about it. Obviously, none of the palm leaves or stones or parchments from Muhammad's time containing the text of the Quran are still in existence now. There is no Codex of Abu Bakr. There is no Codex of Uthman either, not even a single page. So which Quran is it that is perfectly preserved? We cannot even say with complete certainty that the Uthmanic Quran is perfectly preserved because we don't have the Codex to compare it to, let alone Abu Bakr's Quran, let alone Muhammad's. Now, obviously, Muhammad's faithful followers would have tried to preserve whatever they could of the Quran when Muhammad died. But these are all just humans and mostly uneducated. So how can we know that their efforts resulted in the perfect preservation of the Quran as apologists claim? Not just mostly correct, but a letter for letter, word for word, perfectly preserved Quran. We don't, of course, and that's the point. The claims about the Quran's perfect preservation are entirely faith-based. They have exactly zero evidence to back them up. And it's completely fine for Muslims to take the preservation of their Quran on faith. After all, Christians and Jews do the same thing about their religious texts. But for Muslims to go around claiming that the perfect preservation of the Quran is proof of their faith is as illogical and absurd as claiming that their faith is the proof of their faith. Completely circular reasoning, which is not based in reality at all. But when have logical inconsistencies ever been a concern for Muslim apologists when arguing their faith?